The moon program shouldn't have just stopped. NASA had the rockets, the trained crews, and a nation cheering it on. Yet after 1972, nobody went back. The answer didn't come from a scientist or a politician. It came from the astronauts who were actually there. What they finally said on record changes everything. The peak. Nobody noticed at the time NASA's budget hit its highest point in 1966, when the agency received close to $6 billion, equal to about 4.4% of the entire federal budget. Apollo alone was eating up roughly 60% of everything NASA spent that year. What almost nobody realized, watching the moon landing 3 years later, was that funding had already started dropping, well before Apollo 11 ever left the launch pad. By 1969, NASA's share of federal spending had fallen to about 2.3%, less than half of what it had been at the peak. Congress had approved enough money to finish the race to the moon, but it had never promised to keep paying at that level once the race was actually won. That gap between spending at the peak and spending by the time of the actual landing explains a lot of what happened next. A small group inside the White House was about to make that gap official policy. In July 1969, while Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were still touring the country after their flight, President Nixon put Vice President Spiro Agnew in charge of a group deciding what NASA should do next. A month later, that group handed Nixon 3 choices. One ended with astronauts on Mars sometime in the 1980s. Another sent robotic missions to Mars around the same time. The cheapest option kept a space shuttle and a space station, but pushed any Mars decision decades into the future. The price tags ranged from about $4 billion a year up to $10 billion. At a moment when NASA's yearly budget was already down near $3.5 billion and still falling. Nixon picked the cheapest path, and that choice quietly ended any real chance of more moon landings before a single Apollo 18 astronaut had even been named. That decision set a budget ceiling nobody in Congress wanted to argue with. What came next was choosing exactly which already planned missions would get cut to fit inside it, and the cuts came faster than almost anyone expected. The missions that never flew. In July 1969, NASA still expected 9 more moon landings, stretching all the way to a mission called Apollo 20, planned for late 1972. Within about a year, 3 of those missions were gone. Apollo 20 was canceled first, its Saturn V rocket handed over to launch a planned space station instead. Then, Apollo 19 was canceled. A third mission was folded into the schedule of an earlier flight. NASA leadership had reasons beyond money, too. Deputy Administrator George Low and Houston Center Director Robert Gilruth both pointed out that President Kennedy's original goal, landing a man on the moon before 1970, had already been met on Apollo 11. Every mission after that carried real risk with less clear payoff. Gilruth was quoted saying the missions should stop soon, before someone got killed doing something the country no longer felt urgent about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 6 planned missions had shrunk down to 3 remaining flights, each one now carrying the full weight of being possibly the last. Nobody knew yet which crew would end up making that final walk. The last footprints on the moon. Apollo 17 launched in December 1972, carrying Commander Gene Cernan, pilot Ronald Evans, and geologist Harrison Schmitt. It was the sixth successful landing and the longest stay on the surface of any Apollo mission. As Cernan climbed the ladder back into the lunar module for the last time, he said the crew was leaving as they came, and, God willing, they would return one day with peace and hope for all mankind. He believed that. Most of the country at the time probably believed it too. Nobody standing on that launch pad in 1972 could have guessed the wait would stretch past 50 years. The rocket that had made the entire program possible was already being taken apart before Cernan's capsule even hit the ocean. The rocket factory that shut down. The Saturn V was the largest rocket ever successfully flown, standing over 360 feet tall and generating more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Building one required specialized factories, custom tooling, and tens of thousands of skilled workers spread across contractors nationwide. Once NASA's budget was cut and no more moon landings were scheduled, that entire production line was shut down for good. One final Saturn V was used in 1973 to launch Skylab, America's first space station, and after that, the rocket never flew again. Cernan later described watching Cape Canaveral workers lose their jobs by the thousands in the years surrounding Apollo's final flights. More than 13,000 positions gone, with hundreds more pink slips still coming, even as his own crew was training for its flight. Losing the rocket meant losing more than hardware. It meant losing the engineers who understood how to build it, the suppliers who made its parts, and the institutional knowledge that takes years to rebuild once it disappears. That loss stayed mostly quiet for years, until one of the astronauts who lived it decided to start saying so publicly. The smaller ship that replaced the dream. With the moon program gone, NASA shifted almost entirely to low Earth orbit for the next 3 decades. The space shuttle became the centerpiece of that shift, sold to Congress as a reusable spacecraft that would make getting to orbit routine and cheap. It never fully delivered on that promise, flying far less often and costing far more per launch than originally advertised. The shuttle carried out important work, including building the International Space Station piece by piece, but it never left low orbit and never carried a single astronaut back toward the moon. In 1986, the Shuttle Challenger broke apart shortly after launch, killing all 7 crew members and grounding the fleet for more than 2 years. Astronaut Sally Ride, America's first woman in space, later led a task force studying where NASA should focus next. And even that review kept the agency's ambitions close to home rather than pointed back at the moon. 3 decades of shuttle flights kept America active in space without ever answering the question Cernan kept asking in interviews, which was why nobody in charge seemed willing to finish what Apollo had started. That question would resurface again and again every time a new administration walked into office. The astronaut who said what NASA wouldn't. Gene Cernan spent much of his life after NASA giving the same blunt message. He said it was a real shame that politicians threw away the sacrifice and accomplishments behind the moon landings. He argued the country had become a spacefaring nation and then abandoned the achievement, trading genuine exploration for smaller, safer projects closer to home. In 2004, sitting in the audience as President George W. Bush announced a new plan to return to the moon, Cernan heard his own words from 1972, quoted back to him from the podium. Bush promised to make those words come true. Cernan had heard similar promises before, and he knew exactly how much congressional support usually followed them. His skepticism turned out to be earned, and he was not the only Apollo astronaut whose honest answer about the delay ended up getting misread by the public. Another moonwalker gave an answer around the same era that spread online for entirely the wrong reason. The other answer that got twisted. In 2015, Buzz Aldrin sat down for an interview and was asked by a child why nobody had gone back to the moon in such a long time. Aldrin answered that they did not go there, meaning they had not gone back. And that was simply how things had played out. Years later, short clips of that answer spread online, edited down to make it look like Aldrin was confessing the entire moon landing had been faked. Fact-checking organizations traced the full recording and confirmed Aldrin was answering a question about the decades-long gap, not questioning his own flight. In the fuller version of that same conversation, Aldrin gave the actual reason in one plain word: money, before adding that the mission had already accomplished exactly what the president at the time had asked for. Stripped of the confusion, Aldrin's real answer lined up with everything Cernan had already been saying for years. Both men, from opposite corners of the same program, kept pointing at funding and political priorities rather than any technical wall standing in the way. The program that died before it launched. Bush's 2004 announcement grew into a NASA program called Constellation, built around new rockets named Ares, and a new capsule meant to carry astronauts back to the lunar surface by around 2020. Billions of dollars went into Constellation over the following 6 years, along with real hardware testing and a full test flight of an early rocket design. Then, in 2010, an independent review panel concluded that Constellation's budget and schedule simply did not match what Congress was actually willing to pay for. The program was canceled that same year, with much of its rocket and capsule design later reused in smaller pieces for other projects. Billions had been spent, and the moon was no closer than it had been in 1972. Each new administration tended to reset NASA's direction, and large programs built for a 10 or 20-year horizon rarely survived a single change in the White House. Vice presidents kept making the same promise anyway, decade after decade, regardless of which party held the office. The promises that kept coming and going. Since Apollo ended, multiple vice presidents have promised a return to the moon, including George H.W. Bush, Dan Quayle, and Mike Pence decades later. In 2017, Pence announced under the Trump administration that NASA would send astronauts back to the lunar surface, 4 years earlier than a target NASA had previously set. NASA's budget that year sat at about half of 1% of total federal spending, a small fraction of what it had commanded during Apollo. Historian Teasel Muir-Harmony, who curates the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian, has summed up the pattern in 3 plain words: political will. Sending people to the moon takes sustained funding and sustained priority over many years in a row, and Washington has struggled to hold on to both at once. Around the same time these programs kept rising and falling, a poll came out showing just how little of the public was even asking for a return in the first place. The poll number that explains everything. A national poll found that only about 8% of the American public wanted to see astronauts return to the moon. People still admired Apollo as history, but that admiration rarely translated into demand for a new, expensive program to do it again. Space historian Roger Launius has pointed out that politicians get almost as much attention from announcing a return to the moon as they would from actually funding one, without the political cost of raising taxes or cutting other programs to pay for it. That gap between public affection for the past and public support for the price tag helps explain why so many announced moon programs quietly faded a few years later, one administration at a time. Low public pressure meant NASA never had the leverage to demand a stable, multi-year budget the way it did during the actual space race. It would take an entirely new kind of pressure, this time from a foreign competitor, to finally get a program with real staying power. The mission finally. Trying to finish the job, NASA's current effort is called Artemis, and it is explicitly built around returning astronauts to the lunar surface, this time including the first woman and the first person of color to walk there. Artemis flew an uncrewed test capsule around the moon in November 2022. It's Orion spacecraft traveling farther from Earth than any spacecraft built for astronauts ever had. Artemis 10 is scheduled to carry a crew of 4 on a flight around the moon without landing. The first time humans have traveled that far since CERN's crew came home in 1972. A landing mission is planned to follow after that. The program has already cost far more and moved far slower than Apollo did, with its price tag climbing past $90 billion and its timeline stretched across more than a decade so far, compared to the 6 years it took Apollo to go from a blank drawing board to an actual landing. Even with that cost and that pace, Artemis has something earlier proposals never had. A foreign competitor, China, openly working toward its own crewed lunar landing later this decade. That competition is doing now what curiosity alone could not do for 50 years, giving Washington a reason to keep paying for the return trip instead of letting the program quietly die the way Constellation once did. What comes next? Gene Cernan died in January 2017, having spent 44 years as the last man to walk on the moon, a title he openly said he wished someone else had taken from him decades earlier. The reasons the moon missions stopped were never really a mystery inside NASA itself. Budgets got cut from a peak of 4.4% of federal spending down to a fraction of 1%. A factory that built the world's most powerful rocket was shut down for good, and years of political promises to go back kept arriving without the sustained money attached to make them real. Cernan spent his life saying so plainly, and Aldrin's own answer, once the misleading edits were stripped away, said exactly the same thing in a single word. Artemis is now the closest anyone has come in 50 years to finally answering the promise Cernan made on his way off the surface. Whether it finishes the job or becomes one more program that quietly fades depends entirely on the same thing it always has: whether the political will lasts long enough to see it through. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.